Welcome back, everyone. We are getting ready to start our final session for the day, on the hidden histories of public domain land. And special shout out to the 59 people who are still with us online. Thank you so much for being part of our long day. I'm going to invite everyone to take their seats. I now get to introduce you to the third co-PI for the 1817 project, who's serving as the moderator for this panel. So join me in welcoming Eric Hemingway.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming. And I want to say miigwech for having the opportunity to share here today with this very esteemed group, people I've worked with, looked up to, learned, read their works, and to now be in a room and have a conversation with. I want to show gratitude for that. But before I get started, I want to give an introduction of who I am in my traditional language of Anishinaabemowin, and it helps me center my words and my thoughts going forward, and it also respects the ancestors who are here before us, and this is a large part of why I do the work, is because of them. I am here. So I'm going to make some mistakes, Alphonse, in the language, so don't hold it against me. But I'm trying. It's a real tongue twister. But here we go. Genebik and Zinzakas, Anamaticamek, Waganuxing, and Donjaba, Anishinaabe, Odawa, Endau, and Jijik Dodem, and Gitchendamat. And Gitchendam, Mabagijigat, Manda Oki, Minwa, Mino Babanaziwan, Minwa, Enjinikian, Mapi, and Anishinaabe Aki. So my Odawa name that I took is Genebik, the snake. So snakes are good. I've seen a lot of stuff about snakes and pipelines. And I was talking to my mom about this recently. She's like, that's not us. That's a different story. So I had to get that off my chest because it's been really bothering me. I see stickers and art. I'm like, our serpents are good for us. They take care of us. Gitchi Genebik and the Genebik. And I am from a place known as Cross Village, which is part of the larger Waganuxing area, land of the crooked tree. And that is today called Emmett County. And Cross Village is not really Cross Village. It's the place of the prayer tree. So in learning my language with the elder that Jim brought up earlier, Pine Shillman, and Jim called me out saying I've known him since I was 5, which is true. That's how it goes in Indian country. You work and you do things together for a very long time. And the place of the prayer tree is often referred to as Cross Village. And I was asking my elder, Pine Shillman, one day, what is this place? What is my home? And he goes, on Matukamek, place of the prayer tree, and there's a giant cross literally in Cross Village. He's like, not that. Let's get away from that. That at one time there was this tree that was bent by this very powerful spirit before Anishinaabe, and that made it the place of the prayer tree. And also tied with Waganuxing, land of the crooked tree. There's that tree. So a lot of these things are embedded in our language and locked in. And I was really appreciative of Jim talking about the Mille Lacs elders sitting them down and telling them the beginning, because that's where all of this starts. So that's my home. And I identify as Anishinaabe Odawa. And those of you not familiar with the term Anishinaabe, it's often interpreted as the real people, the good people, or the real good people. And that's how I self-identify. And I'm just very happy to be here today on this land of the Anishinaabeg. So with this session about public domain lands and treaties, and we've had a lot of really compelling conversation about what treaties are, how they're interpreted, the language, the legalities. And when we were starting this work, I was a co-PI, and I was joking around with Jonathan. He's like, living with treaties. I'm like, yeah, that's every day for me, dude. Like, I live with treaties every day, better or for worse. In some regard, and all Native people, not all Native people, because you learn about Hawaii and Alaska, they have different relationships that often exclude treaties. But for us in the Great Lakes, treaties are embedded in every aspect. And the treaties that we talk about in the program here, the 1836, that's been brought up many times, and 1855, those are cornerstone moments for us as Anishinaabe Odawa people in northern Michigan. But in talking with my mom and other elders, it's like those don't define us. We hear a lot about treaty rights and this treaty era. That's a larger scope of our existence, that these treaties did happen, but we're not defined by them. And these are rights reserved and not rights granted. And growing up in northern Michigan, and when these treaty rights were being exercised by the local Odawa community, there was a lot of pushback. And people were like, oh, you got this privilege. I'm like, wow, let's talk about privilege. No, these are rights that we've been doing for 20,000 years. And we're just continuing to do them in this regard. But we had to sign these agreements called treaties to continue to do these rights and these activities that sustain not just our livelihood, but just feed the soul. And we have a quote here from one of our leaders in the early 1800s, Augustine Hamlin Jr., also known as Kanapima. And he is a remarkable individual. If anybody knows, Steven Spielberg or any movie producers, I got a story for you, because this is about vision and taking action when you know things are going to get difficult for you and your communities. So my ancestors, the Odawa, fought against the Americans in the Revolutionary War, Little Turtles War, which resulted in the Treaty of Greenville, and then the War of 1812. So that's how we met the United States, is combat. Fighting, and we're fighting for land, rights, way of life, things that we have been entrenched in since time immemorial. We're on the losing end of all these wars. And then after the War of 1812, we have to decide, how are we going to navigate going forward? How are we going to stay home? It's all about home. And we sent scouts to Oklahoma and Kansas, and no offense to anybody from Oklahoma and Kansas, but they came back and said, there's no water and there's no trees. We will not survive. So how are we going to do this? And so I love this story about Kanapima because it shows vision. It shows thinking outside the box. And the leaders from my area chose 3 of their own youth to go study at a seminary school in Cincinnati. And from that seminary school, 2 were chosen to go to study at the Vatican to be popes, William Blackbird and Augustine Hamlin. And this is the 1820s. This is pretty early stuff. While at the Vatican, they're studying, William dies mysteriously. We don't know the circumstances, but he does not make it back. Augustine Hamlin is never ordained a priest, but he does make it back, and he can speak Latin, French, English, and Anishinaabemowin, and he's 23. So he's kind of a genius. And in November of 1835, our ancestors left Harbor Springs, also known as Wikudonsing, the small bay place, in birch bark canoes in November, mind you, and they paddled all the way to Washington, D.C. to negotiate this treaty with characters that were not sympathetic. They were openly hostile towards natives: Lewis Cass, Henry Schoolcraft, Andrew Jackson. And you're going right into the lion's den. So many times the treaties were negotiated in a more neutral place, but my ancestors said, no, we're going to them, because we have to be preemptive in these decisions. We have to be out in front of this. And actually our leaders, Puxigun and Kanapima, left before anybody and tried to negotiate a treaty on their own. And the United States sent them back and said, we need more representation from this area. And that resulted in Grand River, Muskegon, also Little River, Grand Traverse, Little Traverse, Mackinac, and Sault Ste. Marie. 6 distinct tribal communities gathering at a hostile environment to try to secure lands and rights in perpetuity. There's a lot of drama involved. Not all the tribes agree in this, and it takes weeks for the tribes to agree amongst themselves, on top of these, debt collectors called traders coming in and saying, this guy owes me money, they owe me money. The United States wants to push us out of this area permanently, but these leaders are dead set on maintaining that we have to be home into the future. And part of this quote is a letter that Kanapima sends to William Cass, or Lewis Cass, I'm sorry. And in this letter, it's very long. We took some of the text out, but in the other part of the text, it talks about the ancestors. That is we can't leave them. And he specifically notes that we cannot leave our ancestors, that we have to be here with them. And another guy named Nawagijik, Noonday, he's kind of a stud. He fights in the War of 1812. When Tecumseh falls in battle, he takes his body off the battlefield along with some other warriors and hides the body. That's hero status. He writes a letter also to Cass at this time, talking about how God gave us Indians the land, and we have to be where the bones of our ancestors lie. So it's much more than water, fish, trees, growing. It's the people who make you who you are, and they're embedded into the environment wherever you step. So that's part of this treaty negotiation. It's this part about land beyond what you can see and touch. It's everything. Minimum Ziwan, the good life, goes on a lot of different levels. And Kanapima knew this, and he articulates this in these letters to the people who want to remove you. So without that agency and that action, I would be at the University of Kansas right now inviting people out to talk about the day we got pushed. But I'm at the University of Michigan to talk about how we stayed through a lot of agency, a lot of just heroic action, but then vision. So we go through all this process in the 1800s. And then also the context is really important at the time. In the 1835-36 time period, we have catastrophic crop failure. there's a hard, long winter, and we don't have food. And then we have diseases just ravaging communities. And looking through some of these records, entire villages are dying. And the way that people survive is they have to quarantine themselves by going into the woods and hiding until everybody dies in the village. And then you come back out and bury your people. That's the circumstances of this treaty. On top of the U.S. Army actively hunting Indians, catching them and removing them out west. And Indians are scattering. They're going to Manitoulin Island, they're going to Wapu Island, just to avoid the Army. So this is also part of the story of how these leaders got in that canoe, paddled all this way and met and made the agreement and came back. But it was an imperfect agreement. We had to make another treaty in 1855 to secure our reservation, to stay home. But things were not settled because, as Jim mentioned, in 1870, we lost a lot of the land to settlement, but we never lost the reservation. So fast forward into the 20th century. We never leave. We're still here. And I grew up in treaty rights. Poor in money, rich in community. That's what I consider my childhood. And my mom, a working single mom, she cleaned houses for a living, but she got involved in this conversation of history and rights and said, hey, we have these treaty rights. We have a reservation. There's these obligations that the government has to be upheld to. And so they start to grab the torch from previous generations who were fighting for the rights, the Northern Michigan Ottawa Association, who were issuing their own fishing licenses on little pieces of paper. That's pretty awesome. So when the DNR comes in, you got a fishing license? Yeah, here it is. And they're like, what's this? No, okay, but that's sovereignty in action. So this has been going on since 1836, and it accumulates into something that no other tribe had done before that, and we had federal reaffirmation of our legal relationship reestablished. And it went through multiple phases. We got it reaffirmed in 1994, and we became a federally recognized Indian tribe for what that means. There's a lot of moving parts in this. So we have federal recognition, we have a greater degree of self-governance, we have access to resources, and I was really bummed because my mom was on tribal council before then, but it takes a toll working for your own community. And she pulled out before we've crossed the finish line in 94. But after that, we started to get some opportunity to exercise our sovereignty to a greater degree, government, departments, natural resources. And now in 2026, we're in a vastly different place in terms of how we govern and how we look at land. So I wanted to bring a couple panelists I know very, very well, who are both from the Waganaksan community and are knee-deep in treaty rights and land every single day. We're living it, whether it's how we access land, acquiring land. And I used to work for Lower Travis Bay Band for 20 years in the archives department. And I recently came over to University of Michigan about 3 months ago. So it's a hard transition to go from tribal government to big academia, but I'm trying. And so in doing this, I wanted to bring some of my peeps from up in Waganaksan into my new place, and I'm very glad they accepted. But they're going to talk about situations and circumstances that are real time based on these treaties and land. So with that, I want to introduce May Wright. She's our Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, our TIPO, and I'll let her introduce herself because she knows more about herself than I know about her. So I'll go with that.
That's a lot to follow, bud. That was beautiful. Waganakasing da kwenda. Michigan ki we nang donja ba. We kwera sing da nongo. Makwendo dam. Nijoe Indigenous. I'm a citizen of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians. We call ourselves Waganakasing Odawak. I grew up in the northern parts of Michigan, which is why I talk a little funny. My family is from the Straits of Mackinac. My mom grew up in St. Agnes. She now lives just outside Marquette. I got to go to school up at Northern, so go Wildcats, I guess. I now live in Harbor Springs. I've got the blessing of getting to work for my tribe. And the education that they helped me to have access to, I now use for them. I come from a long line of Bear Clan, and I say that makes a lot of sense now, the way my life turned out and the work that I'm responsible for. And within my community, my name is Nijoe. But in English, I just go by May. I'm something called a Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. and I represent my community in cases that involve the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So what that means is I'm one of the many people in my community who carries that responsibility of advocating for cultural resources that are important to my tribe at the federal and the state level. It's also your responsibility to keep relationships with your local community as well. But cultural resource, especially a cultural resource that now exists on something that's considered public land, maintaining that connection, maintaining those protections, that can get a little dicey. Especially because just the definition of what a cultural resource is something that's it's not consistent. If you can just take a moment for me, just try to humor me. Imagine that a stranger has asked you to present them with what it is that makes your community unique. Why it is that you are you and no one else. What is something you would present to them? What would you show them? What would you tell them? Would you maybe take them to the home of one of your leaders that still exists? Would you take them to a battlefield of an important event? Would you take them to an archaeological site that's been found and is now protected on the National Register of Historic Places? Or would you maybe speak in your language for them? Sing a song that only your community knows? Feed a food that grows only in your area? There's so many different ways to acknowledge what culture is and where those resources are coming from. And it really is so frustrating when we look at trying to live with this idea of treaties and federal policies connected to cultural resources because we do not have one comprehensive cultural resource law at the state or the federal level. Instead, what we have is this mixtape of stipulations and regulations and laws that specifically involve certain cultural resources that maybe involve protections for religion, like with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, or things that involve historic sites and archaeological districts, like Historic Preservation Acts. But we don't have just one that we can all go to, which means we also don't have just one definition. Even with that moment that you all take to try and define what you think a cultural resource is, that's something that when we're in this world, we have to rely on state and federal agencies to be able to do something like that. And in some cases, can feel like they're the ones who are telling us what our cultural resource is and what's allowed to be protected and allowed to be considered under these protections. So the interpretation of all of this law that we live within, it's so important, and the identity of your interpreters is important. In the same way that I gave you my introduction, all those layers that we present as Anishinaabe peoples, I'm not just showing off that I practiced my language before I got here. What I'm showing you is the land that I grew up on and where I live currently. I'm telling you about the community that takes responsibility for me and who my family is. When I tell you my clan system, I'm giving you an idea of the teachings that I grew up with and the responsibility I carry during ceremony. Those ideologies, that's what guides my work. But when it comes to trying to advocate for what's important to us in that state and federal level, what we're left to work with is those who are in that position of power and what they think is important and how they interpret these laws, how they interpret my community's history, how they interpret whether or not I think we should be protecting a grove of old cedars that show cultural scars from my community harvesting on them from generations past. So then once we get through this idea of who's in charge, their identity and their value system, who's actually getting to make the decisions and the definitions that they're creating, it then turns these cultural resources into these different classifications. Is this a religious site that's going to be protected under some sort of executive order? Or is this an archaeological district that can be listed on a register somewhere? And then not only is it going to be named, but how will you actually be able to protect it and maintain connection? Because when it comes to all of these laws that we've signed on to and treaties we've gone through, when our communities ceded this land, we definitely didn't cede the history that's connected to it and all the ceremony that's connected to it. We didn't cede access to those sacred sites. So now we have this idea of that indigenous land that's been transferred into this idea of something that's public And then because of those stipulations in treaties, sometimes that public land is deemed as necessary for settlement and it becomes private. And then things like those treaty rights and those federal laws that are supposed to protect us through things like NAGPRA and the protection of burials and ancestors are found in federal systems, it doesn't apply to private land. And now somebody like me is left with a situation where you have to figure out how it is you're going to protect the burials of relatives who are now seen as being on land that you no longer have access to. Now, there are some things that do help us, and the advocacy that's been done in this world of cultural resource and this connection to culture is incredible. I know we've gone through some of the specifics of the language of the laws themselves, but I'd rather talk about the peoples and how they lived with this. When you're thinking of what it is that you decide is a cultural resource to you and your community, you also, in that same conversation, need to figure out what it is you're willing to do to protect that resource, to protect that relative. How much are you willing to fight? Are you willing to show up? What sort of tools are you going to be using? When it comes to something like that battle for fishing rights, we have peoples in our communities out here who are constantly showing up in the face of campaigns saying, save a walleye, spear an Indian. We had relatives like one of our elders, Yvonne Walker-Kijik, sitting out on the beach at night while her relatives are out there trying to fish underneath the cover of darkness, while she has a white sheet hung behind her and a .22 on her lap, just in case somebody showed up to try something. We have this idea of, yes, we definitely do have federal policy, things like National Historic Preservation Act, which is where I do a lot of my work within, which was passed technically, yes, back in '66. However, it wasn't until 1992 that we finally had amendments added to that legislation that specifically acknowledged tribal historic preservation offices, because it wasn't until '92 that those offices were starting to be created because of MOAs through the National Park Service within the Department of Interior. By 1996, we only had about a dozen TIPOs that had been created, and they're still going strong. Now, in modern day, the last count was taken in July of last year. We've got about 228 of us in what's now called the US who do this work. But there's loopholes even in that language, because again, it comes to interpretation. It comes down to who's making that decision. And those loopholes lead to things like this land swap that happened in my community, in which, because of the way those laws are written and because of the way they're interpreted, cultural resources that are sitting on land, if no federal undertaking is happening in that space, and federal undertaking means if there's no federal permission that's needed for the action, if there's no federal money that's being used, if that word federal doesn't get used at all, then people like me don't get called when Emmett County is being gifted a parcel of land as well as $1.5 million by a Canadian oil company. So that way they can skirt the review of that land during the Line 5 tunnel project. So it's really a lot of this work, what it comes down to is that idea of interpretation, idea of language, and the identity of who it is that gets to make that decision. And it's not all bad. There's also good things that happen because there's people that acknowledge those pitfalls within the language and within the work. And the way that we combat that is through collaboration. It's through acknowledging when you're in those decision-making rooms, who else is not there. From showing up to a land management meeting and taking a look around to see, are there any tribal representatives here with us? Is there anyone here who's advocating for our otherwise abled peoples? Is there someone in here who speaks a different language? All sorts of things that we need to be looking for. And I think I'll pass it off then, because I know there's so much more that I want to talk about. Especially, I know today I needed to edit a few of the comments I wanted to make because I just got done with the Line 5 meeting a couple hours before this. So, yeah. There's a lot to talk about, but I also want to make sure that I'm respectful of everyone else's time. So, Emily, I'll have you come up.
All right. Good afternoon. Miigwech for having me this afternoon. It is a joy to see and meet new people and familiar faces. It's very grateful for that. And with that, Odaminquay Indigenous, Magizi and Dodom, Cross Village, Lansing, and Donjaba, Harbor Springs, and my community, known as Strawberry Woman. My family is Odamin, and similar to my community members and significant other here, we are from Cross Village and from Land of the Crooked Tree. And my family, for many generations, lived in Cross Village, for a short time in Beaver Island. My father's side for a while in Sheboygan. And with many families from our communities, moved south for work so that we would be able to have a way to earn a living. And so a good part of my life, I lived in Lansing as well. In coming to this conference today, similar in fashion as well, there are many trainings, workshops, conferences, meetings that happened before we got here to be with you. And I'll say I'm coming off of a 3-day conference and talking about food sovereignty, about seeds, about land, and beautiful events and activities that are happening within our homelands here of the Anishinaabe. And when we talk about land, when we talk about public domain, I think that was within our conference title, I think of the work that not only what Eric and May have shared, but the work that we continue to do in the multiple roles that I and we hold in our communities. And so to share a little bit more, I have a very dynamic life, and one important facet of life, I am an elected official for our tribe, Little Traverse Bay Bands. I am on my second full term, and I will say out of so much of that work that has been rewarding, not only getting to know our community in a different way, I had previously been a child protective services worker, but this has also allowed me to see the government side, how federal laws impact us, again, on a daily basis, and state relationships. And to that point, too, local relationships are so vital and also have a very deep impact. And that's not only with municipalities, right? That's also with your private landowners, to which, again, folks have spoke of. So as an elected, I have been able to see behind that curtain to those conversations. And we have a long way to go, yet we've made some tremendous strides as well. And I'll say what brings joy to this work as an elected, well, joy and bittersweet, is being on our reservation, our land and reservation committee. And so as an elected, we have several committees, one with regards to money, with that we look at our revenue, but we also have this land and reservation committee where we work with individuals, tribal, non-tribal partners across our government to review various parcels so we as a tribe will be able to determine how we're able to buy our land back. And so many might have seen that we had pursued our reservation litigation. That's a whole nother presentation, and I encourage you to take a look, read what has come forward with regard to that particular litigation. And we as a tribal government took the stance, as tribal council took the stance that, well, if we're not able to have this particular request and fight come to fruition, our next step is to allocate resources, time, effort to bringing back land under our care. Not ownership, but our care. And listening to words of elders, of our seed caregivers, of elders, mentioned Yvonne, without land. We've heard this time and time again, without land. So I take the role as chair of this committee very seriously. We've been able to engage with local partnerships such as the Little Traverse Conservancy to build those relationships, to build that understanding. As a committee, we've engaged in strategic planning, but ultimately, That work allows us to think of how we care for the land around us. We know that many parcels, if not all of our land, has some type of medicine, has our ancestors who have walked on. We care for our relatives who fly, who walk. Land is a dynamic, living being with so many stories, medicine, and history attached. And so when we think of buying land and bringing that back under our purview, money is important, but it's not everything. But it does allow us to bring land back home to us. There have been individuals who do donate land. Those are few and far between. And if you've been into our homelands, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful place. And I can understand why why those conversations are very difficult. I also know that the story of that land is within me and my ancestors preceding and after. And there's nothing like that. There's nothing like home. And so as a tribe, like I said, we have a strategic plan, but we've been able to embed in those plans our hopes, our dreams, not only for us as humans, but for those that walk on before us and live within those natural habitats. I get teased because I love to buy wetlands. And from our community, like, you bought another wetland. I'm like, yeah, we're buying more wetlands. What about? I'm like, when things go awry, you're gonna want to. You need wetlands to survive, and so everyone's like, yeah, we know. I'm like, but I think the principle stands that preserving land, having those conversations with your community partners, one at a time, speaks volumes. And again, to those partnerships. I'll also say in my other walk of life, I work for the university down the road, Michigan State University, extension, go. Okay, I won't go. Miigwech. All right, I'm like, I'll go there. I fortunately have had the opportunity to also work for MSU Extension, my alma mater, as a individual first in the state to provide education cooperative extension services with tribal nations, communities, colleges. And it has been also one of the most remarkable journeys in my life. I have met some of the most passionate tribal, non-tribal folks who engage in this work to provide education, health, agricultural, and that's a whole nother conversation too, using the term agricultural, which I learned very much at our previous conference this week. But I tell you what, these individuals who are elected and also are appointed and are employed with our tribal nations are some of the most remarkable individuals who have some of the most remarkable history. And as Extension, we're able to work with these individuals to offer programs such as building strong sovereign nations, or we are currently engaging in a soil testing workshop, working with tribal farmers, individual tribal enterprises who focus on farming and ag, tribal colleges as well. So I share that to think about how tribal nations during these contemporary times continue to care for seeds who are little beings all of their own. And I was taught this week too that having a seed sitting on the shelf is one of the worst fates for a being. They all have a life and have a purpose. So I think of those who are caring for our seeds, how we're able to connect that with caring for our soil, and how often do we think about the soil beneath our feet, right? What lives in that soil? Is it able to provide nutrition to those seeds, to us? Are we keeping it healthy for the next generation? There's also a program that's happening called Setting the Straits on Fire, working with our communities to bring back traditional fire usage with regard to berry plains and maintaining of our food system, among other things. So I'll close this moment with, I love questions. I love to have dialogue, but I encourage everyone to take some time once we're done at this conference to think about land and all that it is in another way beyond a commodity. Chimiquach.
It's on. How do you turn this on? It's on.
Oh boy.
So we're gonna have a couple questions, comments to go off of, which is really easy because we're all from the same community. We deal with a lot of the same circumstances, issues with land, and I see land in a lot of different ways. With our community's been in our community since time immemorial, and I think that's worth noting. We didn't get pushed; we stayed, but some bites get taken out of you when you go through this process and having to, go through forced assimilation, boarding schools, being a second-class citizen in your homelands, economic disparities, and all of this. But we're still here, and it's all because of land. And so when I think of land and home, I have my place of Cross Village, but then I think of we're made up of 9 different communities of Little Traverse Bay bands of Odawa. And so my place is Cross Village on Matikamekw. And what's your place?
What's my place?
What's your place?
My place is definitely the North Shore. It is. That's one of our 9 bands. The North Shore, it's considered this area that's essentially from about St. Ignace all the way over to Escanaba. It's the North Shore. That's where, that's where I spent a lot of my time growing up. And it's a place that really does feel so surreal when you're privileged enough to grow up not just with your family, but with your family's history. To stand in a place like St. Ignace and know that we've been there for thousands of years. Right? She's old as old can be, but then she's also covered in a lot of plastic. It's this dichotomy that's really interesting to witness. And then it makes those conversations, though, then when you're trying to maybe explain to a partner or to an agency that this is home, and this is how it's home, this is how long it's been home, it can make that conversation a bit of a dance when you're trying to defend all of that history. But then you're also faced with what it looks like now, which I think is why it is so important when we're thinking about our home and our place, that we're able to actually look around and see our own community being represented in all these different areas. Being able to look at historic markers and see our own language being written on it and stories about us and our community. Being able to have us honored and represented in the boards that run the local museums so that our voice is there and a part of how that place is being managed and how the story is being told. So yeah, for me, the place is definitely North Shore.
Rich. Emily?
My place is Cross Village as well. And I say that not only because my family still has our home that's been in our family for generations. And I say that's also around Y Camp, which now, folks, it's now called Spirit Lake, but Cross Village will always be home. There are stories, teachings, places, plants, patches of wood, or places of woods, like inside and out, almost as well as you know yourself, but you're always learning something new, right? You know when seasons occur, when it's time to pick your berries or to go out harvesting. Like, you get very familiar with where your place is. And it's where you go when you are feeling sad. It's a place you go when you're feeling joyful. It's a place you go for ceremony that holds, and those are ceremonies that folks don't know. Spirit Lake Y Camp is it's a place that is so dynamic for me and us that it's hard to relay. And when I'm feeling down and low, especially during these times, there's a lot happening. That's where I go. I take my dogs and I head out to the woods. I tell Eric, I'm like, I'm going on an adventure. It's always an adventure. You head up, we take the shore, we get to Cross Village. Sometimes I'll make my way to Mackinac, but it's familiar and it's home. So that's where I go for a variety of things that I need to do. But I also I give back too. Again, ceremony, but you always keep an eye out. You also, through LRC, we try to find parcels that we can bring back, again, under our purview. And we've been able to do so along the creek, where we had folks who've traditionally fished, spear, and continue to do so. Because having public access to bodies of water is it's a dynamic conversation back home. So whenever we have a chance to do so, we try to do that. So that's my spot.
We talk a little bit in the brochure about the 1855 treaty. So one of the greatest, I think, responsibilities I had while working for the tribe was working on the litigation to have our treaty boundary recognized as such. And this goes back to 1855, literally. Each generation of Odawa would fight to have the rights for that reservation acknowledged, operating within that reservation. This big thing we call Indian country. It's a big, broad term, lots of moving parts in that. What is it? Why are the tribes so animate about having this Indian country, tribal lands, not just for housing, not just for a clinic, which is all important, but then it's also the ability to have some sort of say within that boundary, beyond how long you hunt, how much you fish, how much you catch. And the work May does that I used to do is repatriation, NAGPRA. It's a federal law. Indians have laws for everything. It's mind-boggling how many laws we have. One of these is NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act, passed 1990, late stuff. And in that, it says, within the boundaries of an Indian reservation, NAGPRA applies even if within that boundary there is private property. So this is one of the rare circumstances where a Native nation can exert some type of authority on private property, but it has to be within the boundaries of an established reservation. And that applies for our ICWA cases too. So ICWA and NAGPRA were cornerstones for this litigation that went into federal court. And I worked on this case for 7 years. And we had to, get a little worked up, but we had to prove that we're Indian. When for centuries there was these efforts to make us not Indian. Through boarding schools and forced assimilation, here we are, we gotta prove who we are, governance, culture, historic events, yada, yada, which we did without a doubt to create this boundary. So we're going through this case, I'm learning a lot, and then this one incident had to be brought up. And it was in 2011 at Holy Childhood at the boarding school. We had a boarding school in our backyard till 1983, one of the last to close. And this is why this case was so paramount, because if we would won the case, any human remains or native within the boundary, we would automatically come in and assume control of the situation and handle it appropriately. This was one of the main reasons for the case. 2011, I get a call from an engineer. And he goes, Eric, you got to get downtown immediately because we found something in front of the old boarding school, right downtown Harbor Springs. And I was like, okay, I come down, the road's all torn up. There's a big pile of dirt. Within the pile of dirt, there's dozens of remains, and they're all from the school. And I look in the road, and there's just a wall of bodies, kids. And he said that within 48 hours, we're going to repave this. And you have to recover whatever you can in that 48 hours, and that's that. So if things would have been different and we would have won our case, the construction would have stopped immediately, we would have came in, we would have assumed all control of that site to make sure we can do the right thing. But since we didn't win the case at that point, we were at the whims of what the local city of Harbor Springs was going to do. And so we, acted immediately, panicked right away, and we recovered what we could. But we could only recover about half of those kids, and half of the kids are still under the road. So every Saturday and Wednesday in Harbor Springs in the summer, they have a farmer's market, and it's right on that spot. So when we talk about land, it goes a lot deeper than what we see on the surface. And there's this incredible amount of energy to go for this land and have these rights recognized for reasons like this. And so I was like, why did you call me? Why didn't you call the cops? You find people, you call the cops. He's like, well, you're the bones guy, Eric. I'm like, yeah, I do repatriation through museums and federal agencies, but that's what they did. And so when we talk about land and how deep these roots go literally into these areas, that has to be part of the conversation. So now May's doing the work. It's heavy work. Emily's on tribal council. And I'm like, what land do you pick? That's like asking what's your favorite kid. I mean, probably some people have a quick answer. But it's like a very hard decision. So I want to throw the question to both of you. What do you see as obstacles to making your decisions when it comes to land, whether what we protect or what we acquire?
Obstacles? Where shall I begin? One, resources. There's continues to be an assumption that tribes make lots of money, and that's kind of, it's honestly a myth. We do have revenue coming in, typically gaming revenue. I know that there is a updated tribal non-gaming economic development report that is out there. I encourage each of you to take a look, because tribes are, in fact, bringing in revenue to their communities and all of ours through non-gaming as well. Be that as it may, I'll say again, back home, the land, how much, $1 million, how much is an acre? I tell you what, to find land that is affordable in general, let alone for us to buy back, is a very difficult task. Resources. And then to the point of how do you choose what part of your homelands you want to bring back home? That is a complicated conversation. And I'll say Tribal Council has had many diverse conversations over the years about parcels. And I joked about wetlands. However, I firmly believe our Tribal Council and previously prioritize, which is really difficult to say, but we recognize the importance of parcels that have medicines, et cetera, and are important to preserve given the development that we've seen happen over the years and continues to happen, especially in the North post-COVID. So development is a challenge, large challenge. Overdevelopment, expanding out into the country, money, development, private development, business owners, private business owners. Those are just three. I'll say laws. There's a conversation being had too on how we're able to manage our land based on some federal policies and federal laws. So when we have land in trust, there are still catches to that. It's another I gotcha kind of moment. And so how are we then able to step up and advocate for our sovereignty, for the ability to say, hey, we paid for this, we got it. We deserve to be able to maintain this to the best of our ability that is best for our community and our nation. And those conversations, as we all know, are complicated and take time, if ever. So, but then you also have the community perspective of what the community's priority is. And thankfully, LTBB also went through a prosperity planning process that we brought in a consultant who is LTBB, worked across our nation to engage citizens, descendants, community members. I maintain that everybody in our community is of utmost importance, whether you are enrolled or not. You are a part of our community. And that has helped guide us also in putting together our priority list. But that's a very as you can tell, it's a very upsetting and difficult conversation to have. But when resources are limited and land is what it is. Over.
You know, that type of work was when I first got to really start spending a lot of time with you.
Yeah.
Was because of LRC.
It's a happy place.
It is. It's our happy place.
For the most part, yeah.
Sometimes. Depends on the day of the week.
Yeah.
Because let's say, for example, for this talk, this idea of how do you pick? How do you pick when you're trying to figure out, let's put ourselves back in 1836. We signed that treaty. We're one of the few groups in the community who actually has annuity payments coming in. Everybody else is in debt. What are you going to do with that money? Yes, you pay off your debts. You make sure you've got a good standing with your other neighbors. You go make sure you've got the American Fur Trade Company speaking up on your behalf, and you try to buy back some of what you signed over. When it comes to how our land and res works, as TIPO, that's one of my responsibilities is to show up for those gatherings and to show up with research. Let's say a parcel has been proposed. It's my job to look at everything I can find out about that parcel. Who owned it? How many people have owned it? Was it ever an Indian land patent that was included in one of those treaties? Do we have any evidence that shows me we've got people who could be buried there, that we have medicines that are growing there, that there's some sort of marking there that shows that we left an imprint on that piece of land, and therefore it needs to be protected. So I do that digging, and I bring it to the council, and I say, this is what I found. This is what I think is important. And that's how I try to help with those conversations. So essentially, when I'm trying to figure out, right, how to respond to that, how do you pick? As a historian, that is how I pick. I look at the stories. I go sit down at elders' luncheon and I ask them for some stories about this specific area that we're interested in. And I listen. Because when it comes to trying to gather this information and figuring out how it's going to be used, how it's going to be cared for, how that data is going to be maintained within the community, because that's what these stories are, right? It's a form of data information. It's just Indigenous data information. I have to be considering who I'm getting it from and how I'm getting it. I have to be considering, did I give a gift to go get that story? And how am I going to honor that information that they just gave me about this land, about this piece? So that's how I pick, is I go back to the history, I go back to the stories, I go back to who and what it is that could be found if somebody who's not us got their hands on this piece of land.
To add on to that, I'll say providing the lens too of our 9 bands and our 9 villages. And so we as Land and Res work with May and the rest of our staff to try and purchase parcels that are adjacent in each of those 9 bands of ours, so we can rebuild those villages and homes that make us LTBB as a nation. So, and out of our staff too, we have Natural Resource who provides their input. We have GIS, Graphic Information Services, environmental, and community input as well. So as you can see, there's many different facets to what we decide when it comes to purchasing or acquiring our land back.
Well, speaking of land back,
Oh no.
I was working at the archives one day. Very interesting place. I mean, you never know what's going to happen. When I was doing repatriation, somebody would just show up with a box and it was full of remains. I'm like, oh, that's different. And they're like, my dad in his youth used to dig. He passed away. We were going through his, estate, and we found this. Can you take care of it? I'm like, yeah, I can. Thank you. And luckily, as a tribe, we have land that's designated for this purpose. We have a certain amount of acreage in the middle of nowhere where we go and reinter our ancestors. So that's one of the reasons we pursue these. And I'm really, really proud to say, my mom was on the first tribal council before we got any federal funds coming in. So it was like literally passing the Folgers can around. And who's going to drive to Lansing to go meet with these people? And who has a car who can make it to Lansing and back? That was the big question. And so that was part of the process. And the first piece of parcel that the tribe ever bought and put in trust is Osborne. and that's our ceremonial property. It wasn't okay, we're going to build a casino first thing, and then this and that. It's like, no, this is going to be like this forever. And that's, what it is. So it's just, we set the tone right away. And then looking back at the history of this, like, we did what we had to do at all times. And in the 1830s and 40s, even though we signed the treaty, what did the tribe start doing immediately? They started buying land, like lots and pieces downtown Harbor, because they know the storm is coming. So they are trying to buckle down and do whatever they can to stay home. And so one day, again, I'm in my office, somebody comes in, non-native couple, they seem really nice. They're like, Eric, we heard you talk, this is great, yada, yada. Like, what about land back? I'm like, what about it? Like, how do we do it? I'm like, you just signed the title over. Like, really? I'm like, yeah, I'll go get the lawyer. That's what happened. They literally talked with our lawyer, and when they make their final journey, they deeded the land over to the tribe. So there's no great alchemy or mystery or, it's like, how do I do this? It's like, it's actually pretty simple. We have legal teams. They handle this all the time. You can do it. And so it's like how these tribes strategize and is different amongst us, but where we live is different. If you come to Emmett County in the summer, it's all these resort communities. So we have a little extra hurdle we got to go through.
Well, in addition, those resort communities, there's segregation given that those are only for individuals who have access to those strips of land, neighborhoods, HOAs. So it's unique is a really mild way to put it. I think it's.
I'm trying to be.
I know you're trying. I'm
trying
a
not to
little.
swear.
You're being very professional. It's good. It's good. It's good.
I'm like, so the fact of the matter is we have many long-standing individuals, families from here, but also foreign entities as well from other countries who have a lineage of resources and funding who continue to have land in those homelands. So when we talk about barriers, you're battling literally with generations of individuals who continue to reside there and try to control the narrative. So.
Yeah. And in some cases, it's not an individual who now owns that land that has your family buried on it and your history buried on it. It's a company.
Yes.
And it's much more difficult for them it seems, for them to wrap their heads around the idea of land back.
So I think we should open up for some questions before we run out of time. I know we're getting.
I'll be your mic guy right here if you guys have any questions.
Hi, thank you for sharing your perspectives today. So boarding schools haven't really been talked too much at this conference until Eric just brought up that example. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about them and how the legacies of those schools and the impacts you see today of those schools show up in the work that you do for your communities today.
How much time you got?
I can do it.
Yeah.
You good? Okay. It's just turned into a whole nother thing. No, I'm just kidding. I'm gonna lock you all in here with me. Okay. The first off-reservation boarding school was established back in 1860 in the Yakama Nation, what's now called Washington State. Then we have off-reservation boarding schools, right? Over in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, 1879. What this is, you can look simply to Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who helped to put all those together in the beginning. It was meant to kill the Indians, save the men, right? So these kids are being put in these schools. And for all sorts of different reasons, right? Sometimes families are putting their kids in these schools of their own free will, but it's because of the situations that they've been forced into. It's because they're put in places where they can't feed themselves, where they're completely impoverished, where they're not even on their homelands anymore. And these schools could be the one kid's chance of being able to have a hot meal and a roof, even with the price that it comes with. And then when the kids arrive at these schools, their family could also be under duress of being threatened with jail time or with fines, being removed from their home if they don't put their kids in these institutions, so they go. And then these little ones have their hair cut, their clothes taken, put into uniforms, their language is outlawed, their ceremonies are outlawed, they're cut off from their families. And you're not taught how to be a person. You're taught how to get a job. You're taught how to be white. And then you go back to your community and you're this completely different person if you make it home. Because as we know, there's a lot who didn't. And we're still trying to get them back. And this legacy, it lasted for so much longer than so many of us realize. And it's just in the US, they went until 1983. And technically, right, she closed the borders in 83. She still remained open for a few more years to day students. That was Holy Childhood of Jesus Indian School in Harbor Springs, Michigan. If you look over in the Canada side, because we now got borders, so Canadian side, they ran until 1997. Friends was on the air when these schools were open. And that legacy still continues in the community, that impact, we still feel it because when you go that long with your language being outlawed and your religion being outlawed, breaking off from your community, from your teachings, we now are in a place where you're fighting to be able to regain that connection and rebuild it. Did I do it? Okay. Now.
Thank you for your perspectives. There was a point this morning where, as deeply as I appreciated the research and the behind the presentations and then the presentations to us, that land was being discussed in terms of the monetary value that the government could put on it and realize in terms of revenue. And I sat here becoming very much uncomfortable by the fact that we're hearing about how that land is valued on one side of the equation, but not how it's being valued on the other side of the equation. And I'm glad that this session has been a part of bringing that to us. So I have a question, and I'm going to do my best to articulate it because it's not yet quite clear in my mind yet. But it has to do with how do we articulate what the value of our lands are in language that can be understood, in language that can, I don't know, but, because if we were to just start putting monetary values on our experiences and the uses we put to these lands and whatnot, we're still working within that framework, the framework of the government and property and all of that kind of thing. And we all know, I'm pretty sure, I know I'm not alone in this, in understanding that, we all, those of us who grew up in Indigenous communities, whether or not on the reservation, many of us did grow up with some sense of we know where we belong. Our parents told us where we belong. And so we've continued to have that relationship with the place. And we even continue to, for some of us who have the privilege of being able to delve deeper into this, we understand how those ancestral lands, they're not only places where our elders are buried, but they're kin to us. They're ancestors to us. And we have all of these stories about, we take care of these lands, we take care of these forests because they're going to feed us, they're going to take care of us. Okay, and many communities have stories about how all of the elements of the lands, from the mountains, the waters, the trees, the skies, all of the beings that fly in the skies, all of the beings that run on the land, there's so many stories about how they are our kin. They're not only our ancestors, but they're our living kin. And so, this morning, my question would have been, how do you put a price on an ancestor? But now my question is more so, what kind of language is available to us to put out that sense of value that speaks very clearly of what the value is of this land to us?
I'll take a stab. I'll stab you. I mean, I've been asked this a lot of times in my work and career. It's almost unanswerable to like bridge the gap of my understanding of value of family and kin that's not human. It's really difficult. So I try to use comparisons like, what does Jerusalem mean to a certain population? What do these other areas that are revered, sacred, mean to those people? And it's even on a different level than that, because it's more than where an event occurred. It's where you exist with everything around you all the time. And it's just different in our areas because most of our area has been altered to such a radical degree. And not just the landscape itself, but the people. And I get asked all the time, and I get questioned like my ethnicity, which is a very uncomfortable question, like, what are you? I'm like, I'm a human. And then they figure out that I'm native, and they're like, oh, you know all this native stuff. I'm like, no, I'm learning. It doesn't happen like that. And a large part of why it doesn't happen because so much of my environment's been altered. So I hear these stories about the crooked tree. The crooked tree is gone. But the legacy and meaning of the crooked tree is embedded in everything at Wagenuxing, including in our Constitution. It says, we the Wagenuxing Odawa. And there are other crooked trees in the area, but not the crooked tree that the spirit bent. So when the landscape changes, we change with it, but we still remain. And so it's very hard to bridge that gap in my experience. But one of the examples I also use is the ancestors, because that's a very human thing. It's caretaking for the dead, at least for anybody with humanity. So I keep coming back to those stories about the ancestors, because that's something people can resonate with, that can kind of transcend, where we come from in our race. But beyond that, when you talk about spirits and spiritual places, little people and all these other things, people are like, oh my God, okay, whatever. So that's when you have to, I think, walk a fine line of how much do we share. And we got 5 minutes. Oh no. Well, a couple more questions.
Hi, what advice would you give to students like myself that is just now learning and having our eyes open to these topics who want to learn more and get involved with this side of activism and history?
What do I tell my show up. Come to community. Reach out to us. Come visit us. Invite us over. Visit tribes.
Feed us.
Feed
us. Yeah.
Eric, definitely. Yes. Feed us. I like desserts, in case you didn't know. So I already beat you all to the dessert table. So, but come spend time and ask. Well, just come spend time. Visit. Let us know when you're around. But also know that there are at times boundaries too.
Right? Essentially, if you see a flyer for, let's say, up in Harbor area about an event happening with the tribe, if you see it on Facebook, you see it at the grocery store, that means you're allowed to come because it's out in the public, right? Unless there's a little footnote that says, we got limited resources, only for the kids or something. The only events that we got going on that you're not invited to, they're the ones you didn't even hear about. Right? They get passed through the Moxon Telegraph. And call your representatives. Make sure they know your name. Go fill up their inboxes and their voicemails. Make sure they know that they're being watched and that people are paying attention to the choices that they're making, especially in regards to following through things like executive order back in 2019 passed through the governor's office to engage with tribal governments.
How you spend your resources.
Yeah.
The funds that you have, Native entrepreneurs. Donate to NICWA. Where you spent, our resources matter where they go. So do the homework, support.
Can I add Native American Studies classes?
Native American Studies classes, yes. Miigwech.
Otherwise, I'll keep talking. Oh, we do got some.
One more. What's that, Sharon?
Just go for it.
So we brought up boarding schools. Oh, okay. So boarding schools topic came up. I know it's not related to like what this session is about, but you all have so much expertise here. So we know the Trump administration has halted the digitization of the collection of stories and histories around the boarding schools in the United States at the national level that was started under the first Indigenous Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland. I found out recently that in Michigan, $3 million was invested into an investigative report for boarding school history in our state. It's been buried. Do you guys know anything about that? Do you have any kind of context that you can add? Because it kind of hit me in the face when I saw it. I was like, I didn't even know this was going on, and now it's being pushed under the rug. Like, why? Yeah, any kind of insight you can offer or comments on that whole situation?
You don't work for us anymore, so
I can say whatever.
we're in a very different position.
I can't answer in a minute or two. It's so complicated and so touchy about how this went in, how it went down. That was like one of the last tasks I was working on at the tribe was this boarding school research. So I do want to say that the tribes are continuing on with their own work and you know, interviewing survivors, getting documentation. So regardless of what the state or the feds do, the tribes are still going to push us forward. And you know, there's organizations like the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, NABS, who is partnering with tribes to keep this work going. But for that particular situation, I have to have a conversation, you know, later because it's very complex. Great time.
Join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you, Eric and Emily and May, for that really beautiful and inspiring and challenging look at LTPB. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being part of the day that has been informative and inspiring and upsetting, perhaps, in some moments. And we invite you back tomorrow to continue this learning and this dialogue. Before I let you go, just letting you know tomorrow we have 2 panel discussions, and then we will wrap up our conference with another free catered lunch that is happening alongside our Community Connections Forum. So if you look in your program and you think, what is a Community Connections Forum? That's the best name we could come up with, the thing that's equal parts resource fair and poster session and tabling event and mix and mingle and ask that question that we ran out of time that you wanted to ask that person or have that follow-up conversation. And so that is what the Community Connections Forum is. And there's going to be a playlist from the Sicangu Lakota DJ Frank Waln playing during Community Connections. So if nothing else, come for the dance party and the free food. And you can stop by the table and talk to me about the Native American Student Stories Project. So tomorrow, if you're coming back tomorrow, please bring your printed program and your name tag. And just so you know, all of our events tomorrow are in Palmer Commons, which is in a different building on a different part of campus. And if you would like to know, there's maps inside the program, but you're also welcome to flag anybody who you've seen. Well, no, not anybody you see on the meet stage. Come talk to me and I will tell you how to get from here to there. So we look forward to seeing you. And thank you so much to the people who joined online today. We really appreciate your presence. Thank you.